Good morning, everyone. My name is Sumaya Khan, and I'm the Outreach Coordinator with Minaret Foundation, where our focus is multi-faith and civic engagement for the Muslim community. I'm here this week for another version of our Faith 101 series. I'm here with Cantor Rollin Simmons from Congregation Emanu here in Houston, and I'll let her go ahead and introduce herself. She's going to be talking to us about Reform Judaism. Cantor Simmons, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm really honored to be here with you and to talk a little bit about myself, about Reform Judaism, about my experience as a cantor. So let's see. I have been in Houston now for 3 years. My husband actually grew up here. We have 2 kids. Levi is 8 and my daughter B is 5. And we had lived in Colorado prior to Houston for 7 years. We lived in Aspen, Colorado, which was a pretty awesome place to live. People say, "Why did you move to Houston?" After Aspen, but we really loved being in Houston. We were looking for a bigger community, more of like access to a city and to Jewish life on a bigger scale, and just to finding more people like us. So that's sort of what led us here. Plus, having family to help us with our kids has been really huge because my husband's family lives here as well. Let's see, I grew up in Boston, Mass, and I have been a Reform Jew my whole life. I grew up pretty involved at my Temple Israel in Boston. So I went to Hebrew school starting in 3rd grade. I went a lot at the time. It was like Tuesdays and Thursday afternoons and Sunday mornings. Became bat mitzvah in when I was 13, and then went all the way through high school as like to religious school. We would go on Monday nights, and it was just always a really special thing that I was a part of, to be in the education part of my Jewish life. And then my Jewish family life was really centered around holidays. Like we would celebrate Passover, which, with a Seder, which is a special meal, light Hanukkah candles, those go to temple for our high holy days, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, things like that. Those are always really special family times that I have special memories of the food we would eat at my grandmother's house, things like that. And then I went to college at Vassar in New York. I studied art history. I never thought I was going to be a cantor, but so I studied art history and Italian. And after college, I worked in an architecture firm, and then did some visual art, and actually went into special education and was received a master's in special education before deciding to become a cantor. And then sort of the musical part of my life, I've always done music. So I always was singing. I played the flute as a kid, and I sang in an a cappella group in college, studied voice for many years, sang in a Jewish choir after college. And those kind of started to become more and more important to me as this idea of becoming a cantor started to come to light.
So if you don't mind me asking, so you said your master's in special education, and then after that you decided to become a cantor. So was there a specific incident? What happened to kind of shift you in that direction?
Well, so I was always very close with my cantor, and just so you all know what a cantor is a member of clergy in the Jewish congregation. In a lot of ways does very similar things to the rabbi, and that's something that has really evolved over time, that the cantor is really a full clergy partner. So, we're teaching, we're officiating life cycle events like weddings, funerals, all of that kind of stuff. So we do a little bit of everything, but I think our main role is to be the music director of the congregation and sort of, in charge of the musical life of the place, from both what the kids are doing through all ages of how music is a part of the congregation. So that's sort of what a cantor does. So my cantor was a really powerful force in my life. I had a really close relationship with him. His name's Roy Einhorn. He actually just retired last week.
Oh.
And I'm just really I don't know, it's just crazy to think that he is now in a new stage of his life. but he was a really important person in my growing up, and he encouraged me to think about becoming a cantor. And I didn't really know that it felt right for me. I thought I might have to change myself to become a Jewish professional. That, well, was I Jewish enough, or, what did it really mean to be a Jewish professional? And I couldn't quite see myself doing that. But I told you I was singing in a Jewish choir in the Boston area after college. And my cantor actually asked me to lead a Friday night service at one, so to be sort of a sub for him. And so I did it, and it was pretty easy for me. I knew a lot of the music already. And so then I started doing that as it's called a cantorial soloist, to sort of be someone to lead services when the cantor, can't be there or needs a break. So I started doing that in the Boston area, and I actually did it for the High Holy Days, the Jewish New Year. And right before one of the big services, my first service that I was going to lead, I overheard two of the young rabbis talking. And as I heard them talking, I realized they sounded like just young guys talking. Like they just didn't, I don't know, there was something about how down to earth, how normal they were, that sort of, I had this revelation that they were just regular people, and they had, chosen this really amazing path. But it I don't know, it just helped me rethink how a rabbi interacts in the world, or how a cantor may interact in the world. And I thought, you know what, maybe I don't need to change who I am to become a cantor. And I started to realize that a lot of the things that I felt I was good at and that I loved doing, music, interacting with people, even the special ed has played a really important role to be able to kind of take information and break it down in new ways when leading worship or when teaching kids. I find actually has played a big role in my cantorate. I started to just see that this job actually could have been built for me, that it was really perfect to have all these different elements. And the thing about being a cantor, you're always doing different things. So, I'll be visiting patients in the hospital and having a pastoral visit with them, or, I'll be teaching our kids for bar and bat mitzvah, or I'll be with our preschool kids, doing a program with them, or I'll be interacting with older people, or at a funeral. I love that I'm always kind of in a different role and learning new things and feeling like it keeps me on my toes.
That's amazing. That's amazing. All right, let's jump into our discussion about Reform Judaism a little bit. So from my understanding so far is that there's three major Jewish movements: Orthodox Judaism, Conservative Judaism, and then Reform Judaism. And I think that's correct from what I had also asked Rabbi Morgan last week. So I wanted to just ask you, how do you think Reform Judaism differs from the other two movements, and then what do they have in common?
So Reform Judaism, I'm actually just started as a sort of teaching assistant for a course on the history of Reform Judaism. So I feel like I'm
perfect
now. But it started in Europe, in Germany. And at the time that it started, there really weren't these denominations. It was sort of like there was Judaism. You were just Jewish or you weren't. And so as the Reform Judaism came out of a need for people who were Jewish, but wanting to be involved in modern life. So as the Enlightenment evolved, people were feeling that they wanted their Judaism to reflect that Enlightenment, and wanted Judaism to adapt to those changes. And so they started making changes in the liturgy, the words of the prayers, in some of the practices, in some of the theology. A lot of changes happened with a lot of controversy and conversation. And there were different reformers who, some wanted to really push the boundaries and some wanted to kind of take a more cautious approach. But as Reform Judaism developed, it just brought a lot of really interesting things into light about how we interact with Judaism, how it's a part of our lives. And I would say now Reform Judaism is really meant to be a Judaism that is about informed choice. So it's really about learning about all of the different structures and frameworks that exist within Judaism, and then figuring out how those structures fit into your life and making it work for you. And so it's a lot of choice, which I think comes with responsibility. I think some people think that Reform Judaism is sort of the most relaxed form of Judaism. I think it's really more intended to be challenging in that you need to decide for yourself. It's on you to take, and it's on us as the institutions, the synagogues, to teach these structures so that people can make those informed choices. And that's something I think we probably could do better at. But I really love that about Judaism because it has a lot of beautiful frameworks, and to take those so that you're not starting with a blank canvas when you're planning a wedding ceremony or you're planning a funeral, that there exist certain structures of how those services should go, but then adapting them to fit with your your way of life. What Shabbat looks like to you. There are a lot of different ways to observe the Sabbath, and just thinking about how you are going to make those meaningful in your family or in your life.
Could you maybe give an example of one of those? So like either the Sabbath or a wedding or something, and like the way that it was originally, like what the framework is, and then the way that some people have in Reform Judaism, the way that you kind of make it your own and make it work.
Yeah. So on the Sabbath, in Orthodox Judaism, people will tend to be much more strict in their following of the laws. I would say that's what characterizes Orthodox Judaism. And so there are very specific laws about how to practice, how to observe the Sabbath, such as not turning the lights on, and so they'll prepare a meal that doesn't involve turning on the stove, or not driving on Shabbat. So they'll live close to the synagogue so that they can walk. And there's a range within Orthodox Judaism of how strictly people follow those rules, rules they actually follow. And so within conservative Judaism, they're not following those rules as strictly, but they might follow some of them more than Reform Jews. And I think Reform Jews are looking at it more as how do these, so for Shabbat, for example, a typical way to observe Shabbat for a Reform Jew would be to come to services, where we light Shabbat candles, where we bless the wine, and then maybe you go out for dinner for a special dinner. Or a Reform Jew might have Shabbat dinner at home with their family. And then there are many Reform Jews who maybe don't do those things, but they send their kids to Sunday school, or so figuring out how Shabbat. Shabbat is a beautiful way to mark the end of the week and to have a rest and to separate the holy of Shabbat from the ordinary of the rest of the week. So I encourage everyone to try it. But I think in our busy lives, sometimes it's hard for every Friday night to have this special meal. So there's a huge range of how people actually observe Shabbat.
Okay, interesting. But they just keep it as like something special. Like this is something special in the week that's different from all the rest of the days.
Yeah.
So last week, Rabbi Morgan had mentioned that when he was talking about conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism, actually, he was mentioning how in the beginning they were very different, but now as time goes on, they become closer and closer to each other. And he said that some people think that now they're so close that they could even merge back together. And I was wondering if I could ask your perspective.
Yeah, I think that there are ways they're similar. And especially when it comes to our worship, Reform Judaism published a new prayer book. It's not new anymore, but it was like 10 years ago or something. And when that happened, there was a lot more Hebrew in our service. And so our services started to look a little more like conservative services, whereas classical Reform Judaism had a lot more English than it did Hebrew. And so there was this shift back to more Hebrew in our service. So I think there are definitely areas where Reform and conservative have kind of come closer together. And I can't say, when it comes to just like organizationally, we have different organizations sort of that are at the head of the movement. And so I don't know if they're having conversations about joining forces, but I do see sort of aesthetically where certain areas of our services have become more similar.
Okay. All right, cool. I wanted to just talk to you a little bit more before we end about being a cantor specifically. So you talked a little bit about what a cantor is and what a cantor does. I want to talk to you a little bit more about like you mentioned there's music in a lot of your services, right? So what are some of the different things? So I didn't realize that music was something that was there, when you guys went to congregation. I didn't realize that that was part of the service. So could you talk a little bit more about that and what that entails and includes?
Yeah. So I would say that a huge part of our worship is music, which of course right now with singing being something we can't do as a group is just really heartbreaking, and it's hard to imagine how we will even be able to worship together if we can't sing. So our worship really consists of a lot of our prayers set to music, and we have a lot of Jewish musicians who are writing music. I write music, who take the words of our prayers and set them to different melodies, or sometimes they'll mix Hebrew and English, shedding light on the prayers in different ways. So our worship really is filled with music. And I would say Friday night is usually, there'll be instruments, like there'll be a piano. Sometimes we have a band that plays. I'd say it's pretty upbeat, where this idea of welcoming in Shabbat is a really joyous thing. And so we often have music that you can really feel that joy as you welcome in Shabbat. And then Saturday morning, our service is a little more, sometimes it's a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah ceremony. And we also have a regular Saturday morning, which is a much smaller group of people. I would say it has a more intimate feeling. I would say that's generally the trend around the country, that Friday night feels a little more like performative and just more lively and more, there's more elaborate instrumentation. And Saturday morning tends to be a little more intimate generally. I mean, of course, every congregation is a little bit different, but that's the general feeling. And then on the high holy days that I was talking about, there's a much more majestic sound. So you'll sometimes hear a professional choir, sometimes you'll hear organ. It leans a little more classical in some of the music that we use for those holidays, because it's really meant to feel, they're called the days of awe. And so they're meant to feel awesome in that sense. And so I think some of that more majestic music helps with that feeling.
That's amazing. And then just a follow-up question, has music always been, like throughout Jewish history, has it always been a really big part of the worship?
So yeah, music has always been a part, and especially within Reform Judaism, which early on made allowances for instruments. So for much of Judaism's history, instruments were not allowed during their worship. And so Reform actually brought in the organ as the first instrument to be a part to elevate the worship, partly inspired by Protestant traditions at the time. And so classical Reform Judaism, which is what existed in this country in the earlier part of the 20th century, was really the main form of music, this choir and organ, and that more majestic feeling, which we now hear more on the high holy days. And then in the kind of 70s, as folk music kind of started to be more of an important part of our culture, we have one pioneer in Jewish music. Her name is Debbie Friedman, and then others along with her, who basically combined folk music and Jewish texts and prayers and brought those together. And so now that's had a huge influence on our religion and on our worship, that most of our music that you're going to hear on Shabbat is more like a folk style of music.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing that. Is there anything else that you'd like to share or think is important to mention about Reform Judaism before we end today?
Well, I just want to say that if anyone is interested to hear the music, you're always welcome to. Right now, we're streaming our services on Facebook. So if you're ever curious to just kind of hear the feeling of what a Reform service is like, you're totally welcome to join us at 6 o'clock on any Friday, and 10:30 on Saturday mornings on our Facebook page, or you can get to it on our website.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I hope you guys find a way to sing together and do that together soon, even with the crazy situation that's going on right now. Thank you again for joining us. And for those of you guys who are watching, if you don't know, Faith 101 is a series we do every Tuesday at 11 a.m., where we talk to different members of clergy about denominations and groups and movements within larger faith traditions. We'll see you guys next week. Thank you again, Cantor Simmons, for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and end our broadcast for the week.